I'm David Thompson, and I've been working in the adaptation team here at the committee for about 5 years now, and have been engaged in developing this report. I'm going to talk briefly about two of the chapters. First of all, the first chapter in the report, which is about the National Adaptation Programme itself, and then the last chapter in the report, which is the assessment we did on local government. So on the National Adaptation Programme and the first chapter in our report, what that chapter aimed to do is give really an overview of what the committee's thoughts and views are on the NAP itself, on the National Adaptation Programme as a document, as a policy programme. Whether the committee felt, and in its expert view, whether the committee decided that the NAP is effective as a document in delivering what the Climate Change Act requires of it, which is to set out the government's policies and objectives for addressing the risks to the UK from climate change. So Daniel's already talked a bit about the actual NAP itself and the structure of it, so I won't repeat that. But just to highlight, though, one thing that the committee did make very clear and point out in this chapter is really highlighting the process of co-creation, as it was termed, the bottom-up approach, the consultative approach to developing the NAP itself, to identifying and developing the whole range of actions that are listed in the NAP, 371 of them in total. And it definitely resulted in a very comprehensive document, a very comprehensive programme, reflecting particularly the local and national challenge of adaptation. We had a go at trying to capture that by putting together one of those famous classic word clouds. And I think, I'm not going to go through it in detail to see it in the chapter, but as you'd expect, climate and change come out quite strongly, but also words like local, risk, local government, I think come out quite clearly there, and sort of demonstrates to some degree that bottom-up approach that was taken to developing the NAP, which again the committee were very supportive of in principle. Now, Daniel's already talked about, as I say, the structure of the NAP, the fact that there are 7 chapters covering a range of themes, that there were 31 specific objectives, so roughly 4 to 5 in each of those themes, and as we mentioned, a large number, 371 specific actions. And those actions are owned by a whole range of organisations, I mean, primarily central government, but not only central government. Again, reflecting that bottom-up approach that was taken to developing the NAP itself. So there's ownership of local government, of course, ownership by water companies and other utilities, academics, so a whole range of organisations and bodies that have been involved in developing the programme. And the NAP sets out sort of 4 broad categories of action, and we had to go actually at mapping those and actually by each of the themes and each of the chapters, just to give an idea of the type of action that's set out in the NAP. And as you can hopefully see from this chart, they vary across the chapters, of course, but the blue actions are those which are quite action-focused in terms of actually measures taken on the ground to improve resilience or take action for long lead time measures, so the green ones. And the blue ones are more around capacity building and improving knowledge and raising awareness and addressing evidence gaps. And roughly the split is about 70% of those 371 actions are around raising awareness and addressing evidence gaps, which is broadly what you would expect, given that the NAP, as I say, is a bottom-up co-creation document and it's focusing on a lot of the actions and activities that are taking place across a whole range of sectors to build awareness and capacity on adaptation. Daniel's also mentioned that the actions on the whole are being delivered, which is very positive. This is a slightly different chart, just showing the breakdown by each of the NAP themes in terms of delivery, what actions are complete or on track. And again, I won't repeat the message from there because it's pretty positive in terms of those actions that have been stated on the whole are on track to be delivered. But I think it's worth just reiterating and summarising what the committee felt overall about the programme itself. And there were 3 areas where we felt that the NAP fell short in many respects in terms of what you would expect from a policy programme, a policy document. And first of those is that it doesn't really give as a programme, it doesn't really give a very strong sense of strategic purpose. So it doesn't make clear which of the risks from climate change are the most important to address, which objectives are the most pressing, and what activity would have the biggest impact. That makes it very difficult to really focus on what the most urgent issues are that need to be addressed. Secondly, the NAP, even though, as I say, it's a very useful list of existing activity, the committee didn't really feel that it amounted to a coherent programme. So it's primarily a summary of existing policies that obviously are relevant to adaptation, and it gives quite a useful snapshot of activity that was underway 2 years ago now, in many respects. But to our knowledge, there was no actual appraisal of the effectiveness of the policies that are listed in the NAP to address the risks facing the UK from climate change. And there wasn't any analysis, as far as we know, of whether new policies may be required or new approaches. And then thirdly, a sort of other key area where we think the NAP falls short is that it's actually very hard to measure progress in the way that the NAP's been structured and the way it's been set out. And as Daniel mentioned, this is primarily because the objectives, those 31 objectives, don't really have or set clear outcomes against which progress can be measured. And that's made it very difficult, actually, for us to carry out a robust evaluation of how effective the NAP is, the effectiveness of the programme in addressing climate change risks. And there are also some issues around the sort of governance of the NAP itself, made primarily within Whitehall in terms of the process that's set up led by DEFRA to sort of coordinate and monitor the implementation of the programme, which is lacking in many respects. So those three key issues really are where we felt the NAP fell short, and it was for that reason, again as Daniel's explained, that we weren't really able to assess the progress against each of those 31 objectives, because that would have been the straightforward way of assessing progress, is whether those objectives are being met, and so whether they're putting the UK on the right trajectory to be addressing the risks it faces from climate change. But because the objectives, as we say, weren't worded or set out in a way that made them measurable, we had to take a bit of a different approach. And this is what we did. We basically identified for each of those NAP themes, those 6 themes that we talked about earlier, so built environment, infrastructure, agriculture and forestry, etc. We divided each of those themes into specific and measurable factors that we think are most important for managing the risks from climate change relevant to each of those themes, and we term those adaptation priorities. And as this chart shows, we identified those adaptation priorities by understanding the sort of main drivers of risk in terms of climate hazards and the wider contextual factors that together combine to affect risk from climate change, and identified those key priorities for each of those themes that we basically want to assess progress against. And we also identified where there are actions in the NAP which are relevant to each of those priorities. This is an example for one of the themes, for the built environment, which we'll talk about in more detail a bit later on. So you see really what the key drivers are that would affect risks to the built environment from climate change. And we identified, as you can see, 6 adaptation priorities for the built environment. 4 of them are directly related to flooding, which isn't surprising because that's primarily the main risk facing the UK, according to the Climate Change Risk Assessment on climate change. But also, of course, important to highlight issues around heat and heat stress in the built environment, and how water is used and demand for water in the built environment. So as I say, we basically assessed, our evaluation was based on each of those 6 adaptation priorities in the built environment. And as Daniel's also mentioned, for each of those priorities we asked 3 basic questions. And then gave a score, a red, amber, green, a RAG score, based on our assessment of each of those questions. And the first 2 questions, as Daniel's mentioned, are important in terms of really understanding whether for each of those adaptation priorities is there a plan, is there a policy in place that is explicitly accounting for long-term climate change, and we'll give that a score, red, amber, green. And are the actions taking place, which primarily are the actions that are in the NAP, but also, of course, if there are other actions that the NAP missed or that have been taking place since the NAP was published, would also account for those. We weren't just looking solely and exclusively at the actions listed in the NAP, but more broadly whether actions are taking place that would help to address the risks that are relevant to each of these priorities. But it's that third column, the third question, which is obviously, in many respects, the most important one, because that's where it brings together the committee's evaluation to come up with an expert judgment, because in the end of the day, that's what this will be, an expert judgment based on evidence of progress that's being made in managing vulnerability relevant to each of those adaptation priorities. And in answering that question, we use evidence, as Daniel's mentioned, based around the indicators that we've identified and developed over the last, so I'm getting into interference, indicators that we've developed over the last 4 or 5 years, which are summarized in dashboards that Daniel referred to. We've also, on our website, got a full list of all the indicators. I can't remember the exact number now, but it's, I think, around 200, which list indicators for each of the different themes, adaptation priorities, which we've used to try and tell on the ground is either reducing or potentially increasing. So what are the key trends affecting vulnerability? Also indicators, but also analysis of the uptake of what we define as low regret actions. And this is where some of the economic analysis that Daniel was mentioning comes in. So we identify, again, where we can, where the data allows it, the sorts of actions that we would expect to see a high uptake of if we were adapting well, as it were. And then we use indicators to actually assess what the uptake on the ground is. So the example there, for example, property level flood protection, we did analysis to identify what the sort of most cost beneficial level of uptake would be, and then found that the actual uptake is well below what would be cost beneficial from a societal perspective. So that's how we've used economic analysis to help interpret what the indicators are telling us. And then also a key thing that we've been looking at when answering that third question around progress managing vulnerability is looking at long-term decision making. So decisions which are being taken today which really need to be accounting for future climate and all the uncertainties for future climate, because they are long-term decisions, because they are, for example, long-term decisions around infrastructure which will last for 100 years, development which will last for 100 years, etc. So there, for example, looking at the decisions being made in the planning system, and are they accounting for future climate change and the risks for future climate change. So by asking these questions and taking this approach, I'm using these criteria, is sort of justify, as it were, or explain the scores that we've then given for each of the adaptation priorities, which we'll go through in more detail as we talk about the other chapters. But just lastly on the NAP, we made a number of recommendations for where we think the second programme could be improved, based, as I say, on the findings and our view on the first one. And again, the key thing we think is needed here is around the NAP being clearer and setting clearer priorities for adaptation, making sure that the most important and urgent issues are being addressed. And this is where the work we're doing now on the next evidence report for the climate change risk assessment, we think will help, because we're going to make sure that in doing the evidence report and preparing it, that we really try and highlight what those urgent issues are, where there is a need for policy intervention of some form, which we didn't think really the first C3RA did so well, and that's probably one reason why the first NAP didn't really bring out what the urgent issues are. So we're hoping that through the work we do in the C3RA, the next NAP will be able to identify those urgent issues. And in doing that, it can then set objectives which are more specifically and outcome focused in terms of actually identifying how those urgent issues will be addressed over whatever time period they need to be addressed in. So objectives which don't just describe processes and activities, but really focus on what the outcomes need to be, and therefore will be more measurable. We think it's important, obviously, as I say, that the next NAP really identifies, in terms of what the urgent risks are that need to be addressed, therefore what the key policies and actions will be needed to respond to those urgent issues. We think it's important that the next NAP continues to take a co-creative approach and be bottom-up in many respects, building on the work that was done in the first one and perhaps widening it to engage with wider sectors such as businesses, for example, which are still relatively not engaged. However, we don't just think that, as with the first NAP, that it's just a question of collating all of the existing activity and then putting it in one document. It needs to be a bit more prioritized, which is, I think, important. And then lastly, it's essential, and we would say this, that the next NAP has a system for monitoring and evaluation, which is a bit more systematic, so that progress can be measured and policy strengthened. So that's it on the NAP. Are we going to go straight on to local government? Okay. So, as I mentioned, the local government chapter which is chapter 8 in the report, so the final chapter, reflects the fact that there is a specific local government chapter in the NAP itself, and that reflects the fact that the NAP, quite rightly, recognised the pivotal role that local authorities play in sort of leading and supporting and indeed driving delivery of adaptation in their communities. But the local government chapter is a bit different in our report and in the NAP really, because it's very cross-cutting by nature. And for this reason, we haven't identified, as we have with the other chapters, specific adaptation priorities or used RAG scores, the red, amber, green scores, in the same way that we have for the other chapters. So what we've done instead is really review more qualitatively the progress that's being made by local authorities in assessing and strategically planning for long-term climate change, for example, undertaking risk assessments and developing adaptation strategies, but also looking at the key functions or number of key functions that local authorities deliver, which are important for adaptation. And we summarise those in the chapter and link them to the relevant NAP themes. And these functions are, there's no surprises here, I expect, because they are issues around the land use planning function for local authorities, for districts and unitary councils particularly, issues around the role that local authorities play in local flood risk management, particularly around surface water flood risk management. In terms of infrastructure, obviously local authorities play a key role in delivering and planning for highways and local transport. In terms of healthy and resilient communities, of course, local authorities fairly recently have a new role in relation to public health, as well as the existing role they've been playing for many years in social care, which clearly are important from an adaptation perspective, as well as, of course, the role they play in dealing with and responding to and planning for emergencies, obviously particularly weather-related emergencies. And in a natural environment, local authorities have a key role to play, again, at the local level, in terms of biodiversity planning and delivering biodiversity objectives. So we looked at, as I say, what progress and what evidence there is that local authorities are considering adaptation and long-term climate change in delivering these functions. But before that, we also looked at the role they're playing in and whether they are strategically assessing risks to their communities from climate change and developing adaptation strategies. And the key issue here, of course, is whether they have the technical knowledge and the capacity and the resources to be able to assess climate change risks to their communities, and whether it's a political priority in the first place. And when it comes to technical knowledge, we found some quite interesting evidence. This isn't our own research. It's a paper which was referenced from Porter et al. In 2014, where there seems to be evidence, at least from this survey, that there's been quite a significant increase in technical capacity and knowledge of local authorities over the last 10 years in terms of understanding climate change risks. So this chart shows, for example, that in 2003, around 20% of local authority officers felt that they were probably or definitely well informed about climate change. That's risen to 70% in a survey in 2013. So clear improvement there. And that nearly 80% of authorities surveyed in 2013 reported that they always or sometimes use climate information provided by the Met Office, compared to 20% in 2003. And that 92% of respondents to this survey were aware of and had access to UK CPO9, the UK climate projections, which is compared to 40% in 2003. So there's evidence that this would suggest that the technical capacity and knowledge is improving, but is that then actually translating into local authorities using this knowledge to assess their risks that their communities face from climate change? And to help answer that, we looked at some existing surveys that have been done over the last few years by the likes of the LGA and the Environment Agency. But we also carried out a survey that we did ourselves of 90 local authorities in England, and we identified those authorities which are, you could argue, are already at the coalface when it comes to climate change risks. So those that are already facing a high level risk of river and coastal flooding, or those that are particularly facing risks from coastal erosion, from heat stress, so particularly urban authorities, and those that are in areas which are already or projected to be water stressed. And we found all those 90 local authorities, and these were all lower tier. I'm just going to wrap up anyway on the key messages for local government. So, as we say, the technical expertise has improved. There's evidence of that. A relatively high proportion of local authorities appear to be still are developing adaptation strategies, which is positive. And I didn't really talk in detail, but we found that when we looked at those functions I referred to earlier, like land use planning, local forest management, transport, etc., that actually it's quite a positive story there too. And a number of the functions which are being delivered are considering both current and future climate change. There seems to be well embedded in a number of those functions. However, there are areas of concern or areas where further progress is needed. So there is evidence from both our survey and others that a substantial proportion of local authorities have reduced effort and resource, particularly in terms of staffing on adaptation over the last 5 years or so. And we think the main reason for that is that it's primarily not seen as a priority. It's seen as a long-term issue. There are more immediate priorities which override any resource or consideration being given to long-term or seen as long-term climate change. And of course, there's no statutory requirement for local authorities to strategically plan for long-term climate change, and often, in many cases, because of budget constraints, local authorities have to really prioritise their statutory requirements above non-statutory ones. And also, did find some concerns, and Catherine will pick this up as well later on, about how some aspects of local authority functions, particularly the more recent ones around public health and the joint strategic needs assessments that local authorities have been producing, in many cases in our survey, did not refer to climate change risks at all. And even risks around which are directly related to public health, around heat stress. And it wasn't like we're not saying there were no mentions, but certainly a minority were picking that up as an issue for public health, which is something that we think could be looked at where improvement could be made. So sorry about that, we got a bit cut off and I've had to wrap up quickly, but over to you for questions.